the European women are starting to dominate. And the reason is not because they've started or they're doing anything too much different. Those are football cultures. So in America, the girls have dominated because many of the European countries haven't taken the women's game so seriously. Mm-hmm. But the reason that they've done this giant jump forward instead of incremental is because they're football cultures. So those women and young girls, whether it's in European countries, many of them, Spain, France, all of them, right?
Hi everyone, and welcome back to the Sporting Global podcast. And today I'm here with Tom Byer, all the way living in Japan. How are you, Tom?
Great, Ole. It's great to be here from Tokyo, Japan, which is my home for nearly 36 years.
That's awesome, but I mean, like you are from New York though originally, so there's a lot of stuff we have to tap into. First of all, like how you ended up in Tokyo and like all this stuff. But I'm super excited to have you here. Obviously, you have a vast experience, and I think for those that are tuning in now, it's gonna be a really dig deep dive into like your career, your experience in the sport industry, and you've done a lot of different things throughout your vast career, from coaching, like you've been on some of the biggest TV shows as well, like in Japan. A lot of cool things that are happening, obviously, and I'm just ready to kind of like just soaking everything in and kind of like take this podcast episode on a complete journey, so if you like this journey, if you think this is some insightful, make sure to like the video, subscribe if you haven't already as well, and write a comment as well about like what do you like the most about this episode. And with that, Tom, I think we're just gonna dive from the beginning. Like, take us a little bit through like how your career in the sport industry began.
Sure. I'll do that by maybe sharing my screen first, because I've got a nice little presentation, and just give me the feedback. I think you can see it.
Awesome. Great. Yeah, it works well.
Okay. Well, probably the easiest way to tell the story is I was born in the Bronx in New York City, and moved upstate New York. My dad was in law enforcement, became a police chief in a rural area in upstate New York. And so I went to high school, I went to elementary school, junior high school, and I went to community college down in the lower hand corner. And that community college, believe it or not, was a very strong, perennial national champion of football, soccer as they call it in America, for 2 years, the previous years I went there. So it was a very, very well-known college in the United States, and we just happened to be national champions. So I went there, and then I got a scholarship and went to the University of South Florida. So that's kind of my short story of my career, my life in America.
Yeah, and I guess like USF as well has a really good sports program, not only like from a collegiate athletic standpoint, but also now on the business side, which is also very interesting. I think they were one of the early adopters too of sport management, which is obviously very, very interesting. But take us a little bit to sort of like your progress, from University of South Florida, and sort of like, I guess, all the way to like your Tokyo, Japan lifestyle and journey, because I mean, like, you've been there for a long time, but just take a little bit to like, going through that bubble, like into like, taking that step as well, moving there and living there now for so many years.
Yeah, well, unfortunately, I grew up playing football or soccer in America during a kind of a difficult period, because our professional league called the North American Soccer League had folded, collapsed in like the early 1980s. So the short version is I wound up involved in Japanese football because my community college head coach, who was Hungarian from Europe, he knew someone over here in Japan who was a Dutchman by the name of Hans Oft. And Hans Oft had become the national team head coach of Japan. So he was very well, regarded here. And I got introduced to a team in Japan, Hitachi FC, which is one of the founders of, also members of the J League as well.
Yeah.
And so I got into playing. I wasn't, tearing it up somewhere. I was just kind of an average player, to be honest with
Right.
you, but I got my way into Hitachi.
Yeah.
But then I didn't last too long there. And then afterwards, I wanted to remain in Japan, so I quickly got into kind of coaching.
Right.
So I made that transition from player to coach quite quickly.
Right.
But then I kind of specialized in technical training. So I'm really a technical coach.
Right.
And there's a difference between being a technical coach and being a coach that coaches teams and performs on a weekly basis.
Right.
I've done that as well, but
Yeah.
I'm very well known as a technical coach.
And I guess like, just from culture standpoint as well, like sort of like making that decision of going to Tokyo and Japan, just it's a big step for a lot of people. Just take a little bit about, like, I know it's like, been, now you're practically local, but in a sense, like, just take us through like I guess like your thought process, and I guess like some of the things that you learned from like just embarking in new culture and a new lifestyle from like your New York, your like your time at University of South Florida as well. Like how was that process, I guess?
Well, as you can imagine, it's a bit of a culture shock, right?
Yeah.
Especially because you come into a country where, if I'm making the transition over to Europe,
Right.
it's much different because the language it's much more easier to communicate with people.
Sure.
But here out in Asia, whether it's Japan, China, Korea, because it's all based on Chinese characters, it's very obviously difficult to learn the language without studying it. And then also the culture, just everything's different, from the food to the weather, to the language, of course.
Yeah.
For a lot of the different ways that you even communicate, even if you can speak the language fluently,
Sure.
there is a very kind of structured way of communicating here in this part of the world. So
Right.
you have to really be adaptive.
Yeah.
There's always that kind of feeling like, when you're coming from a certain culture, especially in America,
Mm-hmm.
many Americans think that, everything in America is being done correct, right? So they try to
Right.
impose their culture, or they impose their way of life on different, peoples or cultures themselves. But
Right.
here you just have to adapt. And I guess I was pretty good at adapting. So yeah, I mean, it's like anything, I think, though. But I think it's a little bit even more of a different transition to these Asian countries where the language is foreign, because you can look at the language and you can't read it.
Right.
But if I go to Italy, Spain, France, Germany, anywhere, I can look at the language, but I can read it. I might not understand it, but I can read it.
You kind of like get an essence, right, of like what's going on, right? And I think that's a really good point. And I'm like, I know a friend of mine as well, when I was studying at another USF, University of San Francisco. So she moved to Japan to Tokyo as well, like a few years back. I might have to introduce you to, she works for Twitter Sports, and she took the step, like, moving over there, and it was a big culture shock for her as well, like, being grown up in the Bay Area, and like, just taking that step. But I think she's enjoying it a lot. It's been a lot of fun, of course, as well. But back to sort of like your coaching journey. Like, take us a little bit about, like, obviously, starting as a technical coach, and sort of like, why did you sort of like choose the technical route of it, and sort of like what was on the, like, I guess, like your coaching journey leading up to where you are, I guess 10, 15 years for further down the line?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So that's really the next slide here. This fella here, who unfortunately recently passed away, Paul Mariner.
Right.
He's one of my closest friends, like a big brother to me. He's a former striker of England. And he got me interested in the work of the Dutchman, Will Curver.
Mm.
And Will Curver, if you're not familiar with his work, most coaches are in Europe.
Right.
He was kind of the grandfather of shining a spotlight on technical skill development. And he created and basically filmed a series of videos years ago, back in the 1980s, I believe it was. That really took the world by storm, because he trained young kids and basically made them into technical geniuses.
Yeah.
So that was the birth of the Curver method.
Right.
So,
right. That makes sense.
Yeah, so I got very interested in that work.
Yeah.
And there's a commercial side of it as well. And so I brought that program to Japan. I brought the commercial business to Japan. I found an investor. They invested heavily into it. This is kind of the slide of it right here.
Right.
And these schools are very popular here in Japan. And I spun out of it about 10, 11 years ago, but I was one of the founders that brought it here, and I ran it for 15 years. It had a major impact on Japanese football because it shined a light on technical skill development. And to this day as well.
And I guess like just also like a question popping up in my head here in terms of sort of like I guess the acceptance, I guess, in a sense from the Japanese culture and people in terms of like, having someone from abroad, coming and teaching them football or soccer as you call it in the US. But like how was I guess like you guys and the project perceived kind of early? Like, did it sort of like help you that you already played there a little bit, like sort of like first professionally, and then sort of like, okay, people kind of knew a little bit already who you were? Or was it sort of like, how was that process around that essentially?
I started going around first after I got out of playing, and I started to do these what we call football clinics, like events.
Right.
And so I built a network up, and I built a reputation up as well. And so I did that, and that gave me the network to later on bring the philosophy. So I brought the philosophy then, and I'd already had a built-in kind of network to be able to go out. I was trusted, I was reliable. And so that's really kind of, it was really a progression. I didn't just all of a sudden, like introduce this coaching philosophy. I paid my dues. I traveled around the country. I've done literally to this day thousands of events in Japan. Right. So after I established myself as kind of a credible football clinician, so to speak, it was much easier to introduce that. And so, I mean, that's what it's really been all about, improving the individual player much more than the team. A different approach to football development. Where technical skill foundation is really the foundation of what you build all the rest of the game on. Right. So ensuring that foundation was set strongly, because most countries in the world, a majority of children who play football are technically poor. They're not that good. So Japan does, the characteristic of Japanese football is that they're very good technically. Okay.
Yeah. It is a very important question here as well, in terms of actually, as you were talking about here, is like, and I remember a lot of back to like my early coaching days as well, without, being anything close to your experience and all the massive experience you've been through. But I remember a lot of like sort of like taking over like a team with, boys of like 12 to 14-year-old. So it's essentially that time, right, where you're going into the big field, things are, more serious, right? And I was taking over this team, and I was like, first thing I was thinking is like, your technical level is not good enough. Like I have to like, I had to like, probably the first 6 months I used on like just training the foundations, because if you can't take a ball, in like and move it, like how are you going to make a play out of it? So it was sort of like going down to the foundation. I was remember like, this is extremely key, because it just trickled down to whatever else you're sort of like working on. I remember like a lot in terms of just building that foundation, right? And then I think like, especially in grassroots too, it's easy to sort of like overlook that. But I think it's also because, I don't know how it is, how it was like in your coaching days in Japan and everything, but like especially in Norway, it's very like, grassroots based. So it's a lot of, parents, volunteers, being coaches. So you almost like end up being kind of lucky of like, who do you get as a coach, of like how much experience they have and sort of like what's their level and their focus, right? So I took over a team where, it's always been like, parents, just letting them play, doing their thing, which is, good. And as long as they have fun, right, which is a key element. But when I was coming in there, I was like, okay, I have to learn. I have to like start and teach them the basics. If they don't know how to, pass a ball or like take the ball in, then we can't do all the other cool stuff that we want to do. We got to start with the basics. How is that for you in Japan? And sort of like, I guess like coming in there, the technical focus, like how was that accepted? And what was I guess like it's changed a lot, from where it is today, but like, especially in that early time, like adapting this culture into, technical training.
Well, it's about awareness, right? It's about, educating people. This slide that I have up here now,
Go for it.
think of all of these different, I call them delivery mechanisms.
Yeah.
We used all of these different mediums to communicate with people.
Right.
We used animation, we used football schools, we used the internet, events, television, newspapers, magazines, as in football magazines, manga within, which is comic books. It's a very big pop culture comic book culture here. Products, when I say products, the old days, VHS videos, DVDs, today those would be apps.
Right.
Well, we used all of these successfully to deliver the same relentless message over and over again. That message, if you want to be a good football player, it all starts with the technical component, period. So when you make that kind of stake in the game, and you basically ensure that people understand, especially at the entry level of football, that football is an extremely technical game, which unfortunately, I hate to say this, takes a ridiculous amount of practice time to become good at it.
Right.
So unless you start early, it's very difficult, not impossible, but very difficult to become a top footballer if you start later on at an older age. And I'm talking about, anything above maybe 10 or 11 years of age. That's a very, very late start for playing football. So that's where I basically made my biggest impact here in Japan. But it's really now I've shifted gears. I mean, I could show you, I just went, for example, just even this little clip, I'll just show you a few seconds of it.
Yeah, let's do it. I want to see it.
I went around Japan for 20 years and I held these huge events all over the country, basically empowering children to practice on their own.
Yeah. That's awesome.
Every weekend, different city, somewhere in Japan. Okay, so, and then I've worked on World Cup. Japan had the World Cup in 2002. I mean, it was kind of like the perfect storm here in Japan.
Yeah.
I'd stopped playing. I introduced that curver methodology in 1993. In 1993, the J League, our professional league, was launched. In 1993, the Japan Football Association put their hand in the air to become the hosts of the World Cup 2002. So football was everywhere, man.
Right.
I'm doing events, I'm doing events with, some of the greatest players in the world. I mean, this was my life for many, many, many years, right? Working with different brands, confederations.
That Oliver Kahn I'm seeing there?
Say again?
That Oliver Kahn I'm seeing there?
That was Oliver Kahn. That's right. So I mean, I've worked with lots of players. I've been very blessed and fortunate. Zinedine Zidane, David Beckham. I mean, I've worked with a lot of these guys, right, over the years. So I also understand. I have a kind of an interesting skill set. Usually, if you go into football, you're a coach or player, you're an administrator. But I understand the marketing side of football. I understand the communication, PR side. I understand how to create content.
Yeah.
I was casted on, I understand events. That's a specialty in itself. Event management.
Yeah.
Understand television because I was on TV. I've written scripts for TV. I've appeared in them. I've directed them.
Right.
So, I'm not saying this to kind of blow my own horn, but I have a very, very interesting insight into football, and I'm able to connect dots probably better than most. So I can sit in a boardroom with the CEO of the Volkswagen Group in China and convince them to build a strategy around my Grassroots initiative. Because I know that I speak the language and I know how to prepare a proper presentation for a mass organization, or, convince a sponsor to come in and sponsor a television show that I'm involved in.
Right.
So that's pretty powerful when you understand the different moving pieces in what I call the football ecosystem.
Hmm.
So it was just, I've been able to, walk in and convince the president of Domino's Pizza to sponsor this program that we had for, I think it was 5 years into Grassroots, where we would actually do an event. And I came up with this idea that we would take a break during it, and this like parade of little scooters would come along and deliver pizzas for everybody to eat during the break, right?
That's a
So,
great marketing initiative. Yeah.
yeah,
No,
it's just, and you learn and you figure out, because first of all, you have to survive.
yeah.
Second of all, you have to be very creative. Third, you also have to it has to make business sense for the brands or the sponsors,
Right.
because sponsors are interested mostly on quantity more than quality. And what I mean quantity is, you're looking at it, these enormous events with hundreds of children, right?
Right.
And work with Canon as well, Canon cameras. This picture is interesting because that person in the yellow is a woman.
Right.
Her name is Takakura Asako, and she worked with me for a couple of years. But then she also went on to become the head coach of the Japan women's under-17 national team, and she took the team to Costa Rica and she won the World Cup. And she's also coached in the Senior World Cup. She's coached in the Olympics. So I've been able to see also that transition between a young player coming up to becoming a coach and being a junior coach and then going on to win World Cup tournaments, right? So it's been a big long trip for me. I'm just going to cruise through some of these pictures instead of talking. Also have worked with young girls on the left-hand side who show up in my event, who then and come to our schools and our camps. And then she goes on to captain the Japan national team. And she's a World Cup champion as well, 2011 versus US. She's also got an Olympic silver medal. I've got all her medals on. So, seeing that as well, seeing what it takes from a young child, from a young age in Grassroots, and seeing that transition, seeing what kind of training they do, seeing what kind of personality they are, seeing what kind of values they have. So I feel like I have a very good insight into what it takes to become a top player or a top coach or someone in football. So it's just, here's a little clip of at my school. These are just average children, man. These are not elite players, but you can see how they're ball mastery.
Yeah.
Ball mastery is king in football. Trust me. And the thing is, the reality is that the best countries in the world that produce the best players in the world, they win the battle at the entry level. The rest of the world often believe that the battle is at the elite level. They believe that they're somehow going to close that gap at the elite level, but they never do. So what I do, and I'm kind of transitioning now into, again, these are things when pop culture, right? The beginning of my TV show would start like this, animation. Then I would present this 1-point lesson that went for 14 years, every weekday morning. So, again, we're able to communicate with millions and millions of children. So all of these kind of opportunities I had, filming and VHS videos, DVDs, writing books, writing for football magazines, and having these like corners on a weekly or a monthly basis talking about the importance of technical development.
Everywhere.
Japan, this is Japan's #1 comic book, 1.3 million copies per month. I had 2 pages in that every month for more than a decade. So using animation. So that's kind of the first part of my long-winded presentation about a little bit about who I am and where I came from. Because now, if we shift into gears here, we can maybe talk a little bit, if you'd like, about my own philosophy, which is called, and the reason that I show all of that and I show this slide is because this is brilliant by Steve Jobs, right? You can't connect the dots looking forward. You can only connect them looking backwards. And that's what I did. Based on everything we just discussed, I had a complete different thinking. And this is basically the beginning of my football starts at home. So that's kind of a little background of my playing career, my coaching career. that's brought me to where I am today.
Mm-hmm.
And as I have a very, very strong belief that the best players in the world, the best of the best, and who are they? Messi, Ronaldo, Suarez, Iniesta, Neymar, Pogba, Lewandowski, Cruz, Ericsson. I mean, all these players.
I hope you want to bring in like a Norwegian name in right now, like maybe like Holland or something like that.
Exactly. No, 100%. Absolutely. And he's one of my favorite young players too. I mean, unbelievable players, right? But
amazing.
when you study these players, you'll find that football started at home for them. And what I mean is that
Right.
it started from a very young age, usually, often even the ages between 2 and 5. But here's the kicker. The parents are usually the underlying factor. They're the game changer. It's usually a father. It's usually a father, but it can be a mother as well.
Sure.
And I've studied this and I've researched it. So I'm not just picking these names out of hats.
Yeah. No, for sure.
So, and what happens is that when you get that early start, when I say early start, most people will agree that football starts when you join a team. I call it crossing over the line into organized play.
Right.
Globally, pretty much it's at around the age of six or first grade. That's when you join a team. Well, here's the philosophy in a nutshell. If you can get a child basically comfortable with the ball at their feet and they've mastered the ball, ball mastery, they become a wizard of the ball and they fall in love with the ball before you introduce the game of football to them, that's the game changer, man. That's the game changer. And there's a bias that manifests in such a positive way because a child, when they show up to their first ever training session, they become usually the better players, become the more popular players. They become usually the leaders of the team because the coach is going to ask the good kids to demonstrate. So now a little 6 or 7-year-old is getting the opportunity at leadership from a young age. And that's self-being, that's self-confidence. It's got everything. So I wrote a book about it. And that's really what I do now is I go around and I spread the word. And I basically shine a bright light on the opportunity that parents have to participate in their child's development. So that's really kind of what I do.
I think you touched upon something very important here. Obviously, connecting all the dots, football starts at home and sort of like the logic around it, of course. But there's one thing here that I like heard as well, like just at the end here in terms of helping, the parents participate. And I think this is a very key word, in terms of participate, because I think a lot of parents are also very like, oh, it's going to be he or she is going to be the best in the world. We have to do everything for him or her, right, in order to achieve that. Take us a little bit through what do you mean about participating and sort of like, I guess, helping the parents understanding that, yes, you can, help facilitate, but at the end of the day, like that inner drive has to be there, right?
Yeah, absolutely. But, in order to build that intrinsic drive into a child,
sure,
they have to enjoy what they're doing.
Right.
And so that's the whole reality of it. So what I'm saying is that I'm not asking parents to become the coach of their kids. There's a big difference.
Yeah.
There's a difference between teaching and there's a difference between coaching. There's a difference between, talent identification, talent development. So what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to empower parents to be able to get their child off to a flying head start.
Right.
And again, what do I mean is that basically get them comfortable with the ball. So I'll show you some, this is what I'm talking about when I'm talking about ball mastery. Okay. So here, this is my boy. Now he's 2 or 3 years of age. Okay.
Yeah.
So the first and most important tenet of development for children is discouraging kicking. But that goes kind of, everybody believes that football is a kicking game. So they usually will take their kids out to a park and they usually will just start kicking the ball back and forth, or they'll get in front of the goal.
Right.
And they'll start shooting at the child, or the kid will shoot, whichever way, right?
Right.
So what we do is fundamentally different. We say, no, kicking is not the first technique that you teach. It's ball mastery. It's learning how to protect the ball from a very young age. But, again, I could talk about this forever because this is my passion. but you also have to understand also the way that the football world perceives development. Many countries that have licensing programs for coaches, education, they lump different ages into different phases of development.
Right.
So this is very important for people to understand. Most football associations in the world, they believe the first phase of development is between the ages of 6 and 9. They call it the discovery phase. And they build the characteristics of a 6 to 9-year-old. And what they say is 6 to 9 years of age, the kids are very clumsy. They have a very short attention span. Okay. Right. And they lack motor skills. This is the way that they process it. So what they recommend is just play fun games related to football and just let the kids roll the ball out. That's a very, very kind of European kind of approach, because coaches' education, which really comes from Europe, and more than half a century ago, I believe that the reality is that football hasn't caught up to what science already knows.
Right.
And that is that skill development happens much earlier than they suppose it.
Yeah.
So we've got all of these antiquated, kind of out of date coaching models that haven't really borne too much fruit, because it's still, when you look at this 211 member association countries in FIFA, 211, only 8 have ever won a World Cup. And it's the same repeat serial winners every time.
Right.
So when you look at what's happening in those countries, they have cultures in place that are very conducive to developing players and much and more. But for me, it's as clear as the nose on the end of my face that parents are perhaps the most important person in a child's football development. And you find that, and you can see it. You can just see it. And I've seen it with my own kids. So what I did was I documented the development of my own boys.
Right.
And basically, for example, what you're looking at right here, okay? This is really, really interesting. I was very lucky because when I was writing the book, Football Starts at Home, I got contacted by a fellow by the name of Dr. John Rady from Harvard Medical School. He's one of the foremost neuropsychiatrists in the world.
Right.
And he's done decades and decades of writing and 12 books about the power of people being physically active, children especially, and the impact it has on your brain. It supercharges your brain. Exercise supercharges the brain. So when I started showing Dr. Rady these videos of my children playing, he started to unpack the process of what was happening in a very academic, medical, scientific way.
Yeah.
So when you watch this video again now, you'll see something much different when I'm talking to you. What you're looking at right now is you're looking at a child developing the skill of how to pay attention, focused attention. Okay. So when a child learns how to pay attention, that turns the powerful learning switch on. So what I mean by that is that when a child is very focused and they have that ability to pay attention, the learning switch gets turned on, and basically deep learning and long-term memory takes place.
Right. And
what this does is it's almost like a superpower for a child. So when you think back now of the Messis, Ronaldo, Suarez, Neymar, the Haalands, all of these players, they have an incredible ability to focus and pay attention and absorb like a sponge in coaching sessions as well.
Right.
And that all, that doesn't happen by freak accident.
No, of course not.
Yeah. So what happened is that we started understanding the learning process much better.
Yeah.
So ball mastery is a brilliant way of teaching a child focused attention. Because you have to understand, in the absence of a parent, these videos don't exist.
Oh yeah.
A kid will never practice like this at 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 years of age with nobody watching. With nobody watching.
Right.
So
go, step up.
So basically that's the knowledge that we're giving to parents of, first, you need to be present with your own child.
Right.
You have to encourage the right things. It's not a kicking game. It's more of a ball of manipulating the ball, mastering the ball, facilitating a love for the ball. Because a lot of these young players, that grow up to become star players, they don't necessarily fall in love with playing football first. They fall in love with the ball, right? So it's a different approach, you know. And when you look at, these videos are meant to inspire parents. So this is my boy, he's 3 years old. And look at that focused attention, man. Look at how he's in the zone, right? And this is where you're developing that intrinsic kind of, ability, because the child believes they own their own free time, they own their own fun, they own their own free will.
Right.
And that's where the magic starts to happen. And sometimes it happens by accident, more often than not. But now we can go through and we can start, getting people engaged. Well, how do we learn? What is focused attention?
Right.
What happens when you don't pay attention? Well, it's very simple. When you don't play, it's the second line here. When we don't pay complete attention to what we're doing at the present moment, the brain activates a host of other synaptic networks that distract it from the original intention. Right. So I tell parents and coaches, you can bring the best coach in the world to a training session for a little 8, 9-year-old or 7-year-old. But if they're not paying attention, the learning doesn't take place. It's the same thing in the classroom, right? Yeah. You could bring a world-class scholar, teacher, teacher of the year to the class. But if your kid or my kid doesn't pay attention, learning doesn't take place. So it's kind of a different approach to football development. But yeah, this is, kind of what I do. And I do this almost on a daily basis. I go through and engage with parents, because really I tell, and I do a lot of consulting with countries, with governments, professional clubs, brands, media. And so what I tell them, the kind of elevator pitch is, okay, your country, I work with countries like Singapore, India, a lot of developing countries. I say, here it is. Here's the pitch. Develop an army of little 5 and 6-year-olds that are skilled at ball mastery.
Right.
And what happens is that when you develop an army of children who are masters of the ball, many of the other problems in football development cease to become problems because of it. And that's the foundation upon which you build everything else. The problem is a majority of kids aren't technically strong on the ball, so they hit a wall. Yeah. So then when you get with a very good coach, the coach is trying to play a system, a tactic, a formation, something. Right. It's only dependent upon the quality of the players, individual players that you can put into those systems.
Right. No, but it was essentially what I was talking about, right? Like when I was kind of like realizing early that, they were not, technical good enough yet to kind of like, there was no point teaching them, the tactics and like how to, play on the big field if they didn't know how to do the basic, technical stuff, because that's what's gonna like make all the process that we're doing so much easier and better, more efficient. So you had to kind of like lay the foundation. And I remember like, just spending like, we spent several months just like, almost like an hour every practice, just like, okay, we have to get in many repetitions, many touches. Excellent. Like you have to be comfortable with the ball. And and the result that we had throughout like those, I remember like 6, 8, also like throughout the full year, it was like, I think people were like amazed of how like we achieved, right? And I was like, well, if you did this when they were like, 6, 7, they would be in a much better position, but that's how it is, So,
absolutely. And as you can see, right, because we've talked about a lot of things even already in the first, 15, 20 minutes, is that I basically developed this philosophy of football starts at home. But again, the way that I'm able to supercharge this whole thing in my messages, because I understand media, I understand content, I understand brands, I understand, TV, I understand, how you create that content and how do you deliver it? Because you can have the best message in the world. And, if you can't get that connectivity, which is key and crucial to anything you're doing, any new idea. But the other thing too is that I traveled around the world these last several years, and I subjected myself to as much scrutiny and ridicule as possible. And there's a saying in the scientific world that something that's new, which this is kind of new, I'm basically challenging the kind of status quo for football development. Yeah. But when you come up with something new in science, it kind of goes through 3 phases. First, it's ridiculed. Okay.
Yeah.
Second, it's vehemently kind of opposed, but then it becomes self-evident. It becomes
Right.
self-evident. And everybody just says, oh, yeah, well, football starts at home. It's got to start at a young grade, the role of mom and dad.
Yeah.
Right now, most football organizations look at parents as kind of the problem in their kids' development because, and they often might be, because they don't understand development. They don't, they push their kids too hard. They don't understand how important the technical component is. It's like a musician, right? A musician, right? If you don't understand the scales, if you don't understand do, re, mi, if you don't have a deep understanding of the notes, it's very difficult to become a really top, especially classical musician.
Right.
Well, I tell families, through these kind of anecdotal kind of stories, well, think of your child too. The technical skills, that's the notes, that's the scales, that's the DNA of a player. So if you want to put a player under a microscope, okay, set up a practice where you constantly putting them under 1 versus 1. Players can't hide when they're playing 1 versus 1. And so you can see either the lack of skill or the technical skill that they possess by putting them under that microscope, and the great players of the world, think of it, right? Neymar, Ronaldo, Suarez, Alan, all these players, they're technical geniuses.
Yeah.
They seem to have more space and more time than everybody else because that's what technique buys you. It buys you more time and more space because you have a better first touch, everything. It all comes together.
It does 100%. And I think, and I wanted to go a little bit into, because we talked a lot about, coaching, the foundation, starting at home here as well. But I wanted to talk a little bit more from like a business standpoint, because you talk a lot about, connecting the dots, kind of like utilizing your experience, and just sort of like utilizing the time of building that reputation, connecting the dots and understanding like all the mechanisms, right? And so, we're helping educating in a sense a lot of young sport professionals, future leaders in the industry that are coming in here, and they're like passionate about football, they're passionate about coaching, they want to they want to contribute, but they're kind of like a little bit lost on the path here. And I wanted to like hear a little bit like your from a business standpoint, and just making this into like a process, like working with Adidas, working with like major professional players. Like take us a bit through like that commercial professional aspect of the whole of your journey, because many can be like coaches helping like on there on the field, but it's a different journey once you're sort of like, okay, now it's a commercial process, now it's a you got to learn the business processes, you got to talk with the brands, you got to get the sponsors. Like it's a different way of thinking. Like take us a little bit through like some key learning points here, and some of like key examples you want to bring out that you think like these young students and professionals can benefit from.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you what, I had an interview a few months back, and the interviewer asked me, he said, like, what would be one of your core principles for business? Right. And I hadn't really thought about it, but I did very quickly.
Yeah.
And I said, well, you know what? Everything I've done in my professional career as either a football player, coach, a business guy, everything I've ever done that I got paid to do, I would have done it anyway for free. Mm-hmm. So when you think about that, that's very strong, powerful statement, right? Because first of all, you've got to find what your passion is. You hear that all the time, but people might not quite understand what that is. Mm-hmm. But I am so passionate about what I do. Yeah. I wake up every single morning, and when I wake up and I go and I do my routine, and then I sign on to my computer or my social networking, sure, I'm almost guaranteed every day to have like a Christmas present under my tree. And what that Christmas present is, someone around the world has contacted me and they want to know more about the business or the soccer starts or football starts at home program. So I've been very fortunate also to know what I don't know. And what I mean is if we go back to this first slide, this is a great story for any young person that's involved in business. I'm going to show you right here. This slide right here. Okay, so here's the story. I was doing when before this is the brand on my shirt. That's Milo, Milo.
Right.
It's like a chocolate Ovaltine type of drink that is produced by Nestle, Nestle Switzerland, right? So in the olden days, after I retired, when I stopped playing, I basically would volunteer and go around free to coach people, coach kids, anybody that listened to me, anybody. And at the time, my Japanese ability was still quite poor.
Right.
So what I did was I went around and I volunteered on US military bases here in Japan, which there's a lot of. I volunteered at a lot of the international schools. So here's the story for everybody to listen. I went to this school called the Canadian Academy, which is about a 3-hour train ride south in Kobe. We call Kobe, Japan. And I volunteered to do a coaching session for a bunch of international kids.
Right.
I arrived there, I do the coaching session. I only asked one child. I said, hey, how long have you been in Japan? He told me a couple of years. I said, well, what does your dad do? And I had no motive at all. I just said, I was curious. He said, my dad works for Nestle. And that was it. Didn't think anything of it, nothing. Right. I went back up to Tokyo, 3-hour journey. The next day or the next couple of days in my apartment, and I had a roommate at the time, I opened up his Japanese newspaper and I saw this big full page advertising for the Milo International Football Cup tournament. I thought, wait, I started connecting the dots.
Right.
So, and at the time I was kind of looking around to see how I could stay in Japan. I wanted to get a sponsor to do exactly what you're looking at in this picture here.
Right.
So the long story short, I called to the school, and in those days, you had to find people's phone numbers. We didn't have cell phones or internet. And basically what happened was I asked the coach, I said, hey, listen, when I was there, I did this coaching. When I did the coaching, I said, one of the kids said his dad worked for Nestle. He goes, oh, that's the Yost family. So I got the phone number to the house. I called that evening and the child answered the phone. And I said, hello, this is Tom Byer, blah, blah, blah. I said, hey, listen, didn't you say your dad works for Nestle? He goes, yeah. I go, what does he do? He goes, he's the president.
No way.
Where? So then the father got on the phone and basically I told him, I'm looking for sponsors, this and that. From that phone call, he gave me the name of the product manager for Milo, who was actually in Tokyo. And again, the long story short, I contacted that guy. I told him that the president told me to contact him. I went in and had a meeting with him at the end of 1988.
Yeah.
And I literally walked out of that meeting having agreed to doing 50 Milo branded events the next year in 1989. And that's what you're looking at right now. And I did that. I would go on to do that for 10 years. And I wouldn't even meet that president until 1 or 2 years afterwards. And that was my start. And if I hadn't had that call or I hadn't volunteered to go down to do that event, I might not even be in Japan today. So, you've got to take chances. You have to knock on a lot of doors.
Right.
You can't even begin to imagine. We have a saying in business, right? Especially in the sales business.
Sure.
You throw tons of mud at the wall.
Yeah.
Most of it falls off. Most of it falls off, but some stick.
Right.
Milo stuck for me. And now, because of my vast experience, I did this for 10 years, man. I did this my point is that I surrounded myself with people who could do things that I couldn't do.
Right.
And that's the key to business success, I believe. I have a saying that if you're the smartest guy or gal in the room, you're in the wrong room. Right. So you got to find the room where you're going to find people who can do things that you can't do. So what are those things I couldn't do? Well, I wasn't fluent in Japanese. So how am I going to communicate with anybody? I found one of the only Japanese players who had played professionally here who spoke English fluent. Brought him in as my assistant. He's my interpreter. Me, I didn't have a huge playing career, and neither did that guy. Yeah. So how are we going to gather people? Anybody say this American guy is going to show up to do an event? Nobody's going to come. So I went to one of my buddies who was a big Japan national team star, brought him in.
Right.
So I was clever enough to figure out and build a team of guys that could do things that I couldn't do.
Right.
And now 36 years later, I'm here in Japan. I'm quite fluent in Japanese. I'm trusted here. Yeah. I've had a huge impact on football development. And that's a lot of it is to do because I surrounded myself with people who were able to do many of the things I couldn't do.
Right.
So that would be my big. So now when I go, and we'll go to that slide I just showed you here. So now when I go into the boardroom, right, of a Volkswagen or a AIA Insurance, or I understand, I speak the language now. Because when I was working and doing those Milo clinics, man, I did everything. We stored the drinks, the brick pack drinks were stored in my house, in my vestibule of the lobby of my home. The tent, we had this huge green tent with the Milo logo. Yeah. Those legs, it's a massive tent. Right. Those legs in the tent all stored at my house. Right. When we had to go to an event, I had to call the shipping agency to come over, pick it up. Then when the event would start at 9 o'clock in the morning, myself and my team of coaches, we'd have to get out to the field. We'd have to put the tent up. We had to always stop on the way and buy several containers of milk, because part of the process was stirring the chocolate Milo in the milk to do testing, sampling. Yeah. So I got this unbelievable amount of experience as a young guy. Right. And I was able to see and understand. Then we had to write reports about, and give it to the headquarters of Nestle. We had to bill them with invoices. We had to do our own PR and try to get, newspapers to come around. We did everything. And that was my start. And so I started to understand the business very well, all the different components of it. And, here I am years later, and I've got, this presentation that I'm scrolling up and down. It's 287 slides. Right. Because I understand much of it. Right. And I understand that brands, if you work with a brand, you have to guarantee. You're looking at this picture right here. That's a room with 600 Chinese mothers and fathers in it. Right. Okay? So you have to guarantee to the brand that people are going to show up, or else you can't make a business out of it. And you have to have a good message too, as well. Yeah. Right. Yeah. And so these are all things. You have to be engaging. It has to be interesting for people to come. They're going to have to engage with you. When I went to India, people were worried that nobody was going to show up. My first event ever in India, check this out. This is what the room looked like. Okay. This was panic. There was no standing room anywhere. Okay. So this is, again, I'm not doing this to pat myself on the back. No. It's been many, 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 many years. It's taking me close to 4 decades, that I've been in Japan. I'm aging myself now, but I understand it. I understand, being invited to a conference where you've got, some of the biggest players in development in the world. The guy sitting next to me on my left is the director of the Dortmund Academy in Germany, one of the best academies in the world right now. Right. Or, when I'm invited to Australia to present to, a group of families, or to, I'm getting on stage with a guy like Paul Pogba from Manchester United and a World Cup champion from France. I mean, you can't work at this level unless you know what you're talking about. And football, as you can imagine, hey, get this. I mean, I've presented to FIFA, I've presented to UEFA, I've presented to Manchester United, to Dortmund, to Ajax, all of these groups. And that is not an easy feat to do with an American passport. I can tell you that right now. Okay.
I can't imagine. Like the Europeans are, tend to stick with their own a little bit too, in that sense.
So my lesson is I'm trying to tell your viewers and young people is you have to become, if not expert, at least knowledgeable in your field of expertise, so that you're taken seriously. Yeah. And then you have to also be confident enough to accept an invitation to go to Ajax and sit in their boardroom and present to them, or, to be invited in, to the AFC, which is our confederation, and present to the 47 member associations, all of the heads of grassroots football development.
Right.
So, for young people, it's about volunteering. It's about working for free. It's about trying to get in as many rooms as you can with as smarter people that you can get in with.
Mm-hmm.
It's funny. I tell this story a little bit because I've been very fortunate because of my collaboration with Dr. Rady from Harvard Medical School,
Right.
who's really just a rock star. I mean,
Yeah.
I would be remiss not to just pull the slide up about a little bit about Dr. Rady right here that you will see. This is a man who is a world-renowned expert on neuroscience. And I was very lucky. So I'm involved in a bunch of research projects right now with a couple of really big professors and researchers from universities like the University of Houston, University of Michigan, University of North Carolina, Stanford University, Dr. Rady from Harvard.
Yeah.
And what it is that they're interested in is not so much the football part of football starting at home.
Right.
They're interested in the cognitive, the social, the emotional skills that are being developed through this philosophy.
Right.
So the point I was going to get, I almost forgot why I pulled this up, was because the saying that I have is that if you're the smartest guy in the room, you're in the wrong room. So what I was starting to see was I was going around the world and I was showing my presentation to everybody, and I was sitting there and I was getting pretty confident and cocky, thinking, man, I'm the smart guy. I'm the smart guy in the room. But it wasn't until I started getting in the room with brilliant people like Dr. Rady from Harvard, Dr. Roselle from Stanford University, and all these different smart guys. And in Houston as well, we have a whole research team. There's a group, there's a research group at the University of Houston, and outside their door, it says Houston Dynamo, the professional club that I work with, / soccer starts at home research laboratory. And that's all they do. Awesome. And so my point is that then I started to get in the room with the smarter guys. Right. And I started to correlate things. Who would think, neuroscience or education is going to have a profound impact on football development? But I'll tell you what, I learned more innovative, creative ways for football development through these groups, these academics, than I did in all of my coaching licensing and all of my coaches. Now, that's not to say that coaches' education isn't important, because it is. Yeah. But you have to be well-rounded. You have to, you can't get on a set of railroad tracks and think that, and have lack of lateral thinking. No matter what it is, your field of expertise, of what business that you go into, you'll always learn lots of interesting things from outside of your field of study or outside your field of business. Yeah. And I wish that I had learned that maybe a little bit quicker than I did. But, I've been very lucky to learn many, many different things. So, as the old saying goes, there's, many roads that lead to Rome, and that's true. So never really believe that you've learned everything. And I think that recommend to young people is just become a lifelong learner, a lifelong learner, and always be searching for that excellence. That's a very unique characteristic of Japanese culture, of that kind of Budo kind of belief that you're never quite really arrived, and it's about the journey, and you're always learning, and you're always in search of mastery, always in search of mastery. And I think that, that's a good kind of recommendation for young people and for your listeners in particular.
I mean, 100%. I have kind of a lot of, thoughts and stuff that comes up here just as you're talking. And I don't want to go too much out of the scope, but I think one of the key things that really stuck with me too is that because you talked a lot about, speaking, connecting the dots, right? And speaking the right kind of language. And what I mean about speaking the right kind of language is knowing what to say to the right kind of people in a sense of what is, Dr. John Rathe, what is his angle, right? And he's not that interested in the football side. So how do you approach him, right? And I think that's the very key lesson here that people got to think about is that it's all about the angle, essentially, in a sense. Yes. And I think and of course, like you've been sort of like summarizing a lot of the things here of like, you know, in a sense on the surface of like doing all these things. And I wanted to like kind of like, if we can just dig a little bit deeper into the approach of angle, because one, and this is also another key points, because again, we're talking here a lot about, you know, sport management students, like students that are like wanting to work in sports, right? And if you look a little bit like, of course, European, but also US, where people are like, okay, I mean, like I remember even like from like when I did my master, and it's like, you know, 5-6 years ago in University of San Francisco, and I mean, like we were all like, you know, 25, you know, to 35-year-old roughly, you know, and like I remember like in our first class, and people were asking like, okay, what do you want to be, you know, when you're done, when you grow up, right? And like half the class was like, I'm gonna be the AD, right? And the other half is like, I'm gonna be the GM, right? And so, sure, I mean, like it's great having those goals, but that's gonna take you, you know, 20-30 years before you reach that. And a lot of the people also in Europe is like, you know, they have like this dream, right? Which is great. I mean, like I love having big dreams. I mean, like that's how like Sporting Global came to life. That's how, you know, we're having our global goals. But it's sort of like the essence of like where people kind of like expect the, oh, I'm gonna go to this school and I'm gonna get a job in Barcelona, or I'm gonna get a job in Real Madrid. Sort of like, I want you to just talk a little bit about like just that importance of, you know, starting somewhere in order to end up with like Ajax, Manchester United, Real Madrid, like all these big names and players that you have been involved with through your process, right? But you have to start at the beginning. And of course, like you got like that Milo, like Nestle deal and all this course because you were connecting the dots and grabbing that opportunity. But just talk a little bit about like that importance of, you know, if you don't get that internship at Real Madrid, if you don't get that internship at the Warriors, like it's fine. Like there's plenty of other opportunities. Just you're tossed a little bit around this.
I think you have to, first of all, you've got to be knowledgeable enough, and not just knowledgeable enough, but you have to have enough confidence that you can kind of face the firing squad, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
And what I mean is that what I did was you always get breaks in business and in life. Some things are just, they always come to you. You get bad breaks as well, right? You get bad breaks, you get good breaks. And you just got to know, you just have to understand that, and you have to accept the fact that you're going to have drawbacks. You're going to have things that you go backwards by mistake.
Right.
But if there was one word that I would want to kind of encourage young people to think about when they're talking about business, it would be persistence.
Mm-hmm.
I'm unbelievably persistent. I have showed up many times to places where, you know, I was either rejected or they weren't interested or not many people showed up, but it never, ever, ever really kind of threw water on my passion, my fire, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, but that's because I have a passion for what I do. I have a passion for what I do. So you have to, that first you got to find that, right? What is that, right? What is that passion that you love, that you're literally, you know, we have all of these like sayings and everything and hashtags, and, you know, I kind of use this sometimes, you know, football starts at home. That's the hill that I'm willing to die on, that I am willing to show the football world that is probably perhaps the most important part of a child's development, is that early start in the engagement with the parents and things like that. And not just in football in general, but it has so many other things. So you asked a question before about like, even with Dr. Rady, right? Like, what's his angle? Well, what is he in it for, right?
Mm-hmm.
And like I said, it's not the football side.
Right.
But I'm going to show you one slide right here. This is what he's interested right here. So this is a passage out of my book.
Yeah.
Okay. These aren't my words. These are his. So what happened was Dr. Rady, when he started to see all these videos of my kids playing inside the house and things, he started to break it down. Mm-hmm. So the cerebellum, that's the part of the brain that they thought was mainly responsible for only coordination, assistant, motor functions, blah, blah, blah. The new neuroscience, okay, They know much more about the brain now through functional MRIs and examining the brain's technology, blah, blah, blah. They found out recently that the brain, the cerebellum, is responsible for much more. It's responsible for thinking, remembering, which is memory, decision-making, reading, controlling emotions, and another one, to numeracy, single-digit mathematics. So when Dr. Rady saw, I remember listening to this one time, when I talk to Dr. Rady, I sit with a notebook and I take meticulous notes because the guy's so brilliant, right? So he said something to me several years ago, right? And I wrote it down, and I'll admit it, I didn't know what it meant. I didn't understand it.
Right.
And it wasn't until several months ago, a couple months ago, I had an online Zoom call with Dr. Rady, and I swear I pulled out the booklet and I read the line and I said, Dr. Rady, I finally understood what you said. And this is what he said to me. I wrote it down. He wrote, Tom, you don't understand. You have discovered the fountain of wisdom. And I had no idea what this guy's talking about. The fountain of wisdom? What are you talking about? Until I started connecting those dots and I started realizing that this is what he's talking about. Teaching a child through football, using football as a tool to develop that focused attention, which turns the learning switch on.
Right.
That took me several years to really put all the pieces together, take my presentation around the world, open myself up to questioning, rereading. Here's another interesting thing. When Dr. Rady wrote the foreword and the afterword for my book, I didn't pay enough attention to what he actually wrote. I read it. It made sense. It was a little bit of mumbo jumbo. It was a little bit of neuroscience, and it was above my my intellect, to be honest with you.
Right.
And it wasn't until I went back and I reread the book again, and I focused primarily on his forward and the afterword and all the other stuff that he put it in. And then I started to focus much more my philosophy, my whole football starts at home, more around the neuroscience. Because I knew from a footballing coach, you can see football is subjective. It's observation, right? I can see a player when they can do things, right? When I could see, you know, the videos of like my boy right here, right? I mean, it just makes sense if you got a kid like this that so mastered the ball, this little ball, you can imagine at least he's going to be a halfway decent player, right? You can imagine it. You can see that, right? But I didn't understand the neuroscience part, the cerebellum. I didn't understand. And so what I did was I went through, and this is why now all of this stuff is in my presentation. It didn't used to be. But then I started focusing on this part. Understand, again, this is from Dr. Rady, the learning process for the brain doesn't exist in isolation, the benefits of stimulus. So I started to really focus on this. Well, why is it important not to kick the ball? Why? Because when you control an object with your feet, that's a learning circuit. And so I started understanding that much more. And it just, my whole philosophy just made a much bigger impact on, because what we do, who's my audience? We work with schools. We have programs in the Houston. We have an unbelievable research project going on in the University of Houston. But in order to get schools to participate, they have to want to do it. And I can tell you this much, and this is what I said to a group of people from FIFA recently. I presented to a staff at FIFA. I said, unfortunately, football alone cannot stand on its own 2 feet. And what do I mean? What I mean is that when I get into a room, right, like this, I can't just go to parents and tell parents, hey, put your kids in football because football is great.
All right.
Because one of the major problems we have here in Asia, and again, that adapting, right? Understanding the culture, one size doesn't fit all. What you do in Denmark, what you do here, what you do there, it's not going to fly in Asia. So one of the big problems that I understood was that one of the problems in Asia is most Asian families, they look at sports and football as a distraction to education. So they don't want their kids to play football. They don't want them to be involved in sports. They want them to be sitting down at their desk all day long studying for these grueling entrance exams. Okay. So they don't want, so now we're able to sit down and educate these families and tell them, oh, wait a minute, hold on a second. No, you're missing it. We
Right.
can make kids smarter. We can make them better thinkers. We can make them better focused to concentration. We can make them, better memory. And it's all connected. And that message, let me tell you, is far more powerful than telling a parent that you would just want the kid to play football because football is a great sport and it's the world's game. Yeah. And so this is just a completely different message now. So when I sit down and I go into markets or I go into places like here, I work with the professional club called the Houston Dynamo.
Yep.
So they wanted to pitch this whole idea to work with schools. Okay, well, in order to do that, where did they bring me over? They brought me over to the director of education in the Houston mayor's office. That's her right there on the left, sitting down. I'm presenting. And what happened from that one presentation that you're looking at, you see that colorful map behind the guy that's sitting there, that big map? Those are the 17 school districts. So then the Houston Education Department, they said, hey, let's start. We'll give you access to all our schools. So now we work with the Houston Independent School District, Fort Bend. We work with KIPP charter schools. We work with all of the different, because the educators, again, they're not so interested in the football, soccer element. They're interested in the other stuff. They're interested in the cognitive. So
it also showcases the value of foundation, right? And like researching and justifying, like not just like, oh yeah, this is gonna help your kid with this and this and this. We actually, we did the dirty work. We put down the foundation. We researches. We realized that all these things from all these great minds that okay, this is actually a groundbreaking thing. And then and in addition to that, you take the pieces that are most relevant to who you're speaking to in order for them to like make sense, because again, they don't necessarily need to know or understand all pieces of it, but as long as you explain it in terms of their terms where they, okay, this is what you can relate to, this is the benefits of your audience or like their audience in that sense, that's what matters. And that's going to kind of like build those synergies and collaborations that make sense to kind of like working on the big picture.
Yeah, absolutely. And I pulled this slide up because what we're doing now is we used to just be kind of working with like a football club or someone above, but now I kind of call our program, we're like the glue, we're the stickiness.
Right.
That give different organizations the opportunity to work with each other that wouldn't normally probably have things in common with each other.
Yeah.
But we're connecting everybody. So we're actually almost helping to redesign even the way that physical education is delivered into schools, because our football starts at home or soccer starts at home. It's connecting the PE teachers, physical education teachers, with the lead homeroom teachers and also the homes. So there's a tremendous feedback loop that's going around.
Yeah. Well, I wanted to sort of like, obviously, we've already been kind of like going for like an hour and hour and 20 now. And I was thinking like, just, because obviously, there's so much to dig deep into here. And I wanted to make sure that people are, staying all the way to the end here. And I think like, of course, like there's a lot of great insights and a lot of great, tips. And I'm getting carried away too. So I'm just like, just bringing in new things, and I want to hear your perspectives here. And like, finally, just to sort of like, wrap up this dialogue and podcast, I wanted to just hear like some, just some few key tips for future football coaches, that are interested in going into the coaching route, because I think you've been talking about a lot of different things that has not been focused and thought on, and especially in a lot of different countries, a lot of different areas where they're sort of like going the traditional route of like the football courses, the coaching courses and all this stuff, which again, you already said, it's great having that foundation. But if you could give like some key tips now from your experience on like, what are some things that they should focus on if you want to be, working either with youth or you want to work with professional, football players, what are some of the key things that they need to think about going into this role, going into this industry as coaches?
Yep. Great question. So that's why I pulled up this slide right here.
Awesome.
First of all, they have to understand that there's three different kind of levels of, well, there's more, but just for argument's sake,
Sure.
there's the football starts at home is the pre-entry before kids even join. Okay. Yeah. And I think the biggest thing we find now is that most coaches need to understand this, the impact that can be done in their community or in their culture.
Yeah.
Competitive team, that's when someone crosses over the line, and then there's many different levels, right? Different ages, right? You go from sixes all the way up to the professional elite level, right? So right. Really it's dependent upon, what level that you're going to work at, of what level of expertise that you need to have. Now, in the old school, everybody thought that the professional coach, he knew everything, man. He knows everything. He knows grassroots. He knows entry. He needs to. Right. They don't. Yeah. That's the reality of it, right? Because I can tell you how many people I've been with, without outing any names, some of the biggest clubs in the world or federations where they know very little about young children's development. So right. That's one thing. So as I said before previously too, you got to know what you don't know, right? So don't get into that area if you're not going to be an expert in it. Whatever it is that you are going to go into, become an expert, man. Make yourself almost indispensable where you're the guy that knows the most if you can, right?
Right.
It's always, it never happens, but that's the attitude that you right. should have, right?
Sure.
But I think that, again, if you're starting out coaching, and normally all coaching starts out grassroots, then you get your coaching license, you kind of go up, you go up, go up, go up. But there's a big difference. We call this in mindset. There's a big difference to be whether you're performance-based or you're development-based. And what that means is performance means you need to win at all costs.
Right.
But most youth development coaches should be more about the development side. They don't really care about the winning and the losing. I mean, it's metaphorically, of course, we right. all want to win, right? Sure. But that shouldn't be the priority when you're working with young children. It should be the development of those players, right?
Right.
So I would say, and also pick your role models. Find good mentors. Do a lot of volunteering. Here's another one. Watch a lot of football. We know too now, especially it's more relevant for the women's game. But in countries where girls play more than they watch, those players. So to get to the chase, in America, for example, right? American women's football they've won four World Cup tournaments and 3 or 4 gold medals, I think, right? In the Olympics, right?
Right.
But now there's a difference. They did not do well in the they got a bronze medal in this last Olympics.
Sure.
But that for them was a loss because they've dominated so much.
Yeah.
What's happening now is in Europe, the European women are starting to dominate. And the reason is not because they've started or they're doing anything too much different. Those are football cultures. So in America, the girls have dominated because many of the European countries haven't taken the women's game so seriously. Mm-hmm. But the reason that they've done this giant jump forward instead of incremental is because they're football cultures. So those women and young girls, whether it's in European countries, many of them, Spain, France, all of them, right?
Right.
They don't just only play, they watch.
Right.
So they get a much different, they talk about it around the dining table because of the influence and the culture on the men's game. So bro, that supercharges development. So we're finding now, because I know some of the top people in the United States that work with the best women's players, they're finding that the European girls are much more tactically aware. They're smarter tactically because they watch it. So again, it's the same thing. I mean, find a niche, learn as much as you can, be a sponge, volunteer, watch a lot of football, practice coaching. But I guess on my side, what I'm trying to teach people now too is that understand the impact and the role that the families can have on the children at the entry level. Because, a lot of players, a lot of coaches inherit players that aren't technically good. And everybody points the rifles at them. Oh, he's not a good coach because look at his players aren't good. And there's a limit to how much a coach can have an impact on a young player. That's for sure.
Right.
So they inherit those players. They inherit some really good players. Sometimes they get a little bit too much of the credit. but they get a little bit too much of the criticism as well. So it's going to be a balance.
It balances out.
Absolutely.
Well, with that, Tom, I think if you could just, stop the screen sharing real quick, we'll just wrap up here with a little bit of a, nice, face to face here. Yeah, Tom, I would like to thank you, so much for this pleasant conversation. It's been really insightful. I mean, like, I love all our podcasts because I learn something new like pretty much every week. So it's just it's just so fascinating, to see, what people are doing in the industry. And I'm so glad that we can, spread this message to a lot of, young and future leaders of the industry, so we can help them find their passion. We can help them find a little bit of like what makes sense to you. And if there's one thing I think people should take from this episode as well as, learn how to connect the dots. I think that's a very key element. I don't know if you have like any final remarks before we wrap up.
No, I think, a couple of those kind of things that I've said, like, try not to be the smartest guy in the room, right? Always seek that room where you're going to learn stuff. Right. I always say, I was being brought in by, these professors who are brilliant to learn from me, but I've always been secretly learning more from them, right? So just always have to be searching for that. And then, to find your passion, you need to really find something that you love, that you look forward to doing. And that oftentimes means get out and volunteer, work for free. Go, if you want to be the best, tool maker, go volunteer a summer and work for free or for cheap at a tool place where they make tools. I mean, it's that simple, right? Yeah. But I think for young people, find your role models as well. You want to be the best at something, go find the world-class guy who's the best at, whatever it is, whatever that is. Yeah. And I don't think you can go wrong. You just stay true and learn as much of the fundamentals, right? It's the basics that make you the great players. It's when you watch a football player, right? Especially like a Haaland, these kids like unbelievable, right? His first touch is unbelievable. Yeah. So this gives him so much time and space. He looks like he's, completely at a different level because of his first touch. Yeah. His awareness. And, these players that are very good, they have much more time to play with their head up. They can scan, they can look, they can see the killer pass. They're looking 2 steps ahead. Yeah. So.
No, but I mean, like, this was a very, I don't want us to dig deep to, but as like you were talking about Holland as well and in his first touch, and I was seeing a lot of this like in especially the national team, because he was like doing so well with like Dortmund and like, just like having that, fast-paced plays. And now obviously you have Martin Ødegaard and you have like other great players, but then there are, players that are in the Norwegian league. It's a complete different pace. So I was seeing like when he, he's like, he was already several steps ahead when that pass was coming. So he was like, like it didn't make sense. At that point, it was like, no, but, it's not fast enough. It's not happening fast enough, to what he was used to. And so that's obviously where it's very interesting as well, like kind of like adapting to, the national team and playing around to like making those pieces work. And I think that's, even a discussion in itself.
And that's one of my favorite national teams to watch. And my boys as well. They love to watch because there's so many great young players on that team.
well, I'm glad to hear that Norway at least can bring some joy to the football industry. It's not always we have much to brag about in the football side, but it's an exciting future now, I think, with this team and a lot of good players coming up. So Tom, once again, thank you so much for staying with us this evening for you in Tokyo. And I don't know if you're aware, but we have a little bit of a tradition here in the Sporting Global podcast, and that's that we're learning you some Norwegian. We always wrap the video with some Norwegian language, so this is like a final thing. So with every video we do, we always finish with "Vi snakkes," which means "see you later" in Norwegian.
Say it again.
Vi snakkes.
Vi snakkes.
Vi snakkes. Snakkes.
Vi suckness. Oh, wait. Vi suckness.
There you go. All right.
Okay.
Thank
All
you
right.
so much, Tom. Well,
Okay.
enjoy your evening, and we'll talk very soon. All right.
Okay. Thanks a lot. Take care.
Perfect. Thank you, Tom.
Okay. Bye.